Welcome, everyone, to 50 years of Asian American community lawyering, looking back and looking ahead. This is a panel at the Association for Asian American Studies Conference, and I'm your host, Phil Tajitsu Nash. I'm the co-president of the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, and I also teach at the University of Maryland Asian American Studies program. We have with us today three distinguished participants. They are Andrew Leong, who is a former supervising attorney of the Asian Outreach Unit of the Greater Boston Legal Services and former director of the Chinatown Clinical Program at Boston College Law School. Dr. Alakananda Paul is co-founder and former board member of ASHA, which is now called Ashiyanaa, and providing culturally appropriate and linguistically specific domestic violence and sexual violence services for South Asian women and children. Don Tamaki is a former pro bono attorney for Fred Korematsu, who also served as a legal services attorney, co-founder of the Asian Law Alliance, and executive director of the Asian Law Caucus. Now, obviously, they've done a lot of things in the intervening 50 years, so I'll let them tell you what they're up to now when they speak. Before starting, I'd like to acknowledge that I am here in the Washington, D.C. area on the ancestral and unceded land of the Piscataway people and other indigenous peoples. And each of you is on the land that is unceded from various indigenous communities. And I hope you'll find out more about that on your own. I would also like to thank our sponsors and our tech crew who are doing a wonderful job. First of all, the Association for Asian American Studies, Pawan Dingra, who's the president, Tamara Ko, Jennifer DeLuna. And I also want to acknowledge that ethnic studies and the movement that was part of it has really inspired us as community lawyers. And we'll all be talking about that a little bit more. The 1882 Foundation is providing wonderful technical help here. Mia Owens, Mei Che, Gabriella Chu, Ted Gong, and Stan Liu. The Asian American Legal Defense Fund with Executive Director Margaret Fong and staff, and my co-president Richard Kim and the board. The Smithsonian, including the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage with Sojin Kim, and the Asian Pacific American Center with Theo Gonzalez, Lawrence Min Bowie Davis, and others. And again, thanks to our presenters. Finally, I would like to welcome into the room the many people, including people watching today, and some who have left us on left this planet, who are equally as important, have equally important memories as the four of us who are here today. And it's very important to remember that this was a broad social justice movement, and we were all privileged to be part of it. But there are many, many, many more stories that need to be told. And I hope that you who are part of Asian American Studies and those of you who are out in the community will take the time to get to know some of these people, find out those histories, and preserve that, because this is our Asian American community heritage. So let's quickly set the stage. It's the 1960s, early 1970s, what historian Karen Ishizuka calls the long 60s, and various movements for civil rights and opposing the Vietnam War and other things are happening. The ethnic studies movement is starting at San Francisco State, at Berkeley, City College of New York, and other places. This serve the people ethos is very strong among a lot of people who are on the campuses. And some of them decided to head into the healthcare, legal, social services, education, and other careers. At that time, there were only about 1.5 million Asian Americans. So there's been more than a 10-fold increase in people since then. And there were not as many diverse communities as we see today. So a lot of what we were studying in Asian American studies back then was Chinese, Japanese, Filipino American. And then as I started teaching throughout the 80s, 90s and on, you know, we saw more South Asians, Korean Americans, Southeast Asians, and others. So today, our four guests are going to talk about what happened in their parts of the country, but don't forget, this is just four individual stories, and even within an organization, there can be many stories, many viewpoints. So that being said, let's start with Don Tamaki.
Thank you, Phil. I really appreciate being on this panel. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be with the panelists who each are really experts and have their own story to tell. Shout out to Margaret Fung. I see she's on. She hasn't turned on her camera, but one of the original founders of the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, along with the other co-conspirators. I guess one of the first things I want to say is to lift up ethnic studies, and specifically the Asian American studies. I think the scholars of this field, they don't, Asian American studies has not traded on its good name, but it is responsible really for starting a movement, and more particularly a host of key organizations across the country. And I say that because every social movement that has any sustainability or lasting impact rests upon an intellectual foundation. And, we grew up, or my generation grew up in, I'd say, the tail end of the Jim Crow era in California. Segregation was the norm. And even though California did not enter as a slave state, it imported all of the traditions of Jim Crow, including redlining and segregated facilities. And, we grew up, or my generation grew up in the shadow of the concentration camps. They had closed by 1945. Japanese Americans came back to the very communities that exiled them in the first place, and began their life, but it was viewed as totally normal. And this kind of segregation, continued both de jure and de facto. And so within that, as Phil mentioned, the civil rights movement happened, and the Black liberation struggles. And, there were, 3 or 4 network television stations, as contrasted today. And the impact of watching peaceful protesters trying to exercise the right to vote or travel or go to restaurants, have jobs and so on, and then be set upon by dogs and fire hoses, that had a huge impact. So, I mean, growing up in the era of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, John Lewis, other things had huge impact. But I got to say, we didn't know who we were as Asian Americans. We called ourselves Orientals. And Martin Luther King referred to Black people as the Negro. And so this issue of identity and who we are, where they came from, and what where our place was in the racial hierarchy, none of that was articulated or analyzed. And so this movement for self-determination really launched, of course, the Black community, but spurred the formation of organizations within the Asian American community. And the root of that was the scholarship of Asian American studies and ethnic studies. And there were no materials. I mean, the original teachers were really folks who did their own research, compiled their own materials, started their own classes. The scholarship was very rudimentary, but it led to a sense of going back to our own communities. So if you look at the organizations that are now viewed as institutions, like they've been here forever, they all formed at the same time, which is late 60s, early 70s, mid 70s. And the core of that is all those people took Asian American studies. And so that's what I mean by Asian American studies has not traded on its good name. I don't think scholars necessarily see themselves as change agents, but it totally changed the landscape in housing, in labor, education, and so on. And so within that, Dale Manami and Garrick Liu and Michael Lee and some of the others, they were the first generation of lawyers in the Bay Area. And instead of going the corporate route or the government route, they chose to form the Asian Law Caucus. This was 1972. And there are very few services to the Asian American community. And San Francisco Chinatown, for example, was the most densely, remains the most densely populated area in the city. Some of the highest concentrations of tuberculosis and unemployment and low wage workers and so on. One of the highest concentrations of poverty. As just one example, one community had literally very little services. Healthcare was not really accessible. Mental health care, other kinds of things. So organizations in this sort of go back to the community movement started prompted by the scholarship of Asian American Studies. And so the first set of lawyers, there were very few judges, in fact, no judges of Asian American descent and few lawyers, really. Our role models were Black lawyers in the Bay Area. And so into this thing, you know, the founders of the Asian Law Caucus started and began to basically provide services. And yet we had our own racial profiling at that time. Chinatown in the San Francisco early 70s was in the middle of gang warfare, and two warring gangs accounted for like 18 or 19 murders, some in broad daylight. And Alioto, the then mayor, began to be, you know, concerned that it was given San Francisco a bad name, so he started, you know, street sweeps. And if you were young and Asian American looking, people were picked up and arrested. And that was one of the first cases of the Asian Law Caucus and what was taken on. And that prompted basically some sense that, you know, our community was not represented. And the model at that time was, you know, legal services. That was a new concept too, poverty law, or class action lawsuits. So that was basically the start of it. But then the Asian Law Caucus developed the origins of what I would call community lawyering, which involved taking on those cases that tended to facilitate organizing. And some cases have that capability, not all, but some. And so in housing, for instance, the potential of forming tenants unions, in labor law, representing garment workers, the potential for forming unions and other associations. Immigration was another field. And so the Asian Law Caucus began to develop this new model of lawyering, which was different from doing just class actions and just service kind of cases that didn't have much impact beyond the individual client. And it began, to this day, the units that operate in the Asian Law Caucus still follow that principle. And the principle is, after the legal case is over, there is a lasting community entity there to continue to fight for rights. And so this idea that you could use a law to prompt organizing was pioneered during that time. And I think that's another example of the scholarship of Asian American Studies, where the study of it basically led to theories and ideas, and it led to new ways of practicing, some of which continue to this day. And the overall impact, and I'm going to end soon, but I just want to leave you with the overall impact. Of course, you want to provide services. Of course, we wanted to provide representation to unrepresented people, but we wanted to empower the community. And that in turn led to other organizations, to other political activities. The political landscape in San Francisco is completely different than what it was. Ed Lee, one of the attorneys when I was executive director there, led a first of its kind rent strike in Chinatown, served 13 years, eventually becoming the mayor of San Francisco. first Asian American. And so he wasn't the only one. But again, during this course of politicization, I call it, prompted by Asian American studies, it led to all of that. And so I'm going to stop here, but I just want to lift up the Association of Asian American Studies and give you that dimension that scholars are change agents and have been change agents. And I'll stop here, Phil. Can't hear you.
Thank you so much, Don. And we'll be hearing more from Don. I mean, he's got a million stories that I've heard, so we got to bring those out. Our second guest is a longtime friend of mine and somebody who has been a change agent in several different areas. And her story is also important because not all efforts to provide legal services resulted in the formation of these groups, such as the Asian Law Caucus, the Asian Law Alliance that Don helped to found, or the other groups we're going to be discussing. So Dr. Alakananda Paul is a professor, and I'll let her introduce herself and the topic. Alaka?
Yes. Yes, I'm. Thank you for including me in this really distinguished panel, and so much. You and the others have done so much work in different areas. I'm just a humble person, started something ad hoc in, and I'll talk about the history. But I'm by profession, I'm an engineer. I taught for many years, and then I was last 15 years of my career, I worked for the US government in Department of Commerce. I'm a telecommunication engineer, basically. But I retired and I moved to California, even though my story is about the organization which started in DC metropolitan area. And thank you again for having me. Thank you to AAAS and the other organizations that are sponsoring this. In about 1989, we met in a friend's living room, and there are several stories we have been sharing with each other. That we had one of the co-founders was a lawyer in family law practice. The other one was a social worker. The other were other women's rights activists. And we figured that there is especially South Asian women, culturally, and there's a language and cultural barrier for them to take any support from anyone. So we thought about just starting a women's support group, just a few of us. And we collected a few dollars so that we can start a newsletter, we can arrange some meetings, and we slowly started. So our basic thing was to provide resources to South Asian women, not only domestic violence, but also also mental abuse, lack of control, financial control. And also one thing happened to a lot of recent immigrants was that they were abandoned. They were, married in another country, and then most cases the husband came here and did not pursue their coming here, so they were kind of abandoned in their countries. Or if they managed to come here, then they found that there was a different story going. So lots of different issues, and also children are involved. So we decided to help both women and children. So we first of all we established a hotline where we could give resources, and we did not actually do the legal. We did give legal resources. All our volunteers were trained in legal resources, at least where to go, what are the laws. That they were not at all familiar with the laws, like temporary restraining order and civil restraining order. And later on, when the Violence Against Women's Act was signed, then they had even more rights. Immigrant women have even more rights at that time. But we did, we had one or two lawyers who would answer basic questions, and we tried to enlist pro bono attorneys and also like healthcare workers, because some cases there were, some healthcare needed, and we would accompany the, give them rides, we'll take them to explain the law to them, take them to courts, and very slowly we started first, and then we started organizing monthly meetings and where we'll invite experts in different areas, lawyers, physicians, psychiatrists, to help them out, and it was kind of open to everyone. Then we started networking with other Asian organizations and also other similar, like I was a member of the multicultural task force of the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence, and I was also involved with the Asian American Domestic Violence Project in DC. So we used to network with a lot of different organizations, and we basically started with South Asian women, women from India, originally from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. But recently the name changed to Ashiyanaa, and that I don't know if they are related or not, but it was changed in October 2021. And also recently they started also including Afghan women and children from Afghanistan. And but we have never denied service to anybody. I personally remember advising a Vietnamese immigrant. So we never, even though we basically did for South Asian women, but we will give the same advice to any women and children who will call us. And so we slowly started emerging, and it was like built up slowly. In 19, for example, 97, Phil told me not to give statistics, but just the order of, we serviced like 150 clients, and actually, I mean, we talked to 150 clients and did like maybe 75 cases, but it multiplied every few years. We multiplied, and we are servicing many more people now. I'm not connected with the current board, but I was just try to give the history. And it was so, even I remember once talking to a woman who was had a very senior federal government position, and she and her daughter were both kind of abused. And I said that, you just leave home or whatever you do. But she said, no, I can't do that. Then I'll lose everything. I have no money or anything. I said, no, you have rights. You can go. And she did not know any law. She was a scientist and very senior level government official, but she did not know her rights. So many cases we had to, people would just tell us that, oh no, if we go, then I'll lose everything. There's I won't have any support. And also a lot of the Asian women, I guess it's true because they are always afraid of retaliation. That if I do something or if I report, then, the whole society will turn against me. And it has happened, actually. I'm more familiar with Indian and Bangladeshi community, and it has happened that there were retaliations. But then we give more support in that case. And many times that we have done that, we have so many cases. And then, as I was talking about, and as we progress, this was started, by the way, I don't know if you mentioned, started in 1989 was the first time, and within a couple of years, we registered it as non-profit service organization because we needed to raise funds. And we provided temporary housing, sometimes short-term, no-interest loans. And when some of the people never gave back the loan, that's okay. But whenever we felt that the person can give back the loan, for example, one of our clients and her daughter left their home, and then she went back. As soon as she went back, we said, we put her up in an apartment. And as soon as she went back, we said, now you have to return. Since you went back and did not follow through, but we provided the accommodation to her daughter because she did not want to go back. And she turned 18, so we supported her at that point. So we did as much as we can, and I believe recently there was a lot of cases in which the immigrant women were not getting the proper legal advice, what are as to their rights, and they are kind of left in India or brought here and then abused, and they were told that if they lose, if they turn to anyone, if they complain, they are going to lose their status. So it was like we tried to help as much as we could, and there are so many other cases where, and as the time progressed, we also found out that people are getting old, and there was a lot of elderly abuse or neglect. And then we started also taking care of that. Recently, there is a program that they have a kind of monthly, especially during the COVID, they have a monthly Zoom meeting where say for the senior, for people, elderly people, so that they have a venue to talk to people. So we tried to do as much as we could. There's a lot, though it was not a legal organization, but a lot of the cases involved legal issues, which we did address. And also there are a lot of mental issues too. One time we had a client who had some kind of obsessive compulsive disorder, and her whole family abandoned her. And she was just living in a unimaginable situation. So in that case, we didn't have too many volunteers at that time. So two of us, one is a scientist and I'm an engineer. So we took off time and to go and clean up her apartment, set her up with a pro bono psychiatrist, and somehow kind of, so we did a lot of thing on an ad hoc basis. It was not, it's getting more and more organized as the time passes by, but in the beginning it was just a few of us and whoever will pitch in to help us. And we'll call every month we had a meeting, and we'll call someone who is an expert in that field. And for example, I remember representative, I think she lost the election. She was running for a Senate nomination, I think Donna Edwards. She came, and she was very involved in the Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. So she came and gave us, and then there are other experts, lawyers, doctors, which will come and give us advice, on monthly meetings. And we also networked. We went on just to give publicity so people know that we are here. We'll go on local television stations, and whoever was willing to, include us, will just go and tell them what we do. So did I?
No, you're doing great on time. Before we hand it over to Andrew, there's a story you told me that was very striking, and if you could just elaborate a little bit about this, when somebody who was supposed to be an interpreter said, "What did you do to provoke?" This is an unbelievable story, but it happens within the community. So could you just share that one?
Yes, we used to accompany women to court, especially those who could not speak English well. So I went with a young woman one day. The case was also funny. A lot of these countries where men are allowed to marry more than one, have more than one wives, like Bangladesh, they are supposed to marry the second wife with the permission of the first wife. But of course, the permission is forced. So her husband actually wanted to recycle her. He went and got married. She was here, and her husband went to Bangladesh and got married second time without divorcing her, and came back, and she found out and So she, like, I know there was a big argument and there was some kind of a violence. So she left and we put her up in a shelter. Somebody went and picked her up and put her up in a shelter. And I went with her to the court. It was a summer vacation. I said, okay, I'll pick you up and take you to the court. So there, I was not an official interpreter, but there was an official interpreter there, a Bangladeshi man who was supposed to Bengali. So as she's interpreting, she's saying that in Bengali that, oh, he did this to me and he slapped me or something like that. And then he's saying, that man is telling her, what did you do? Which was, I said, what did you do to invite, to provoke him? So I said, that was not part of his, he is not the lawyer or judge or anybody, nobody should say that. So, but then I didn't want to, because then the judge will say that I'm here's my right. But as soon as we had a, intermission, I just went out and I said, what did you say that? I'm going to report to the judge if you continue like that. You are not going to, you are not asking her question. You just say what she's saying. So this was like and this man was like a official interpreter in the court. And things like that constantly happened. And this thing, it happens in England too, that, recycling this, why actually the fight was because he wanted to take her by force to Bangladesh and abandon her and bring his new wife.
Wow.
Because you can't have more than one wives in USA. So.
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot more stories like that. Well, thank you for saying that.
Right.
Andrew, can you pick up your story? He teaches at UMass Boston and has done a lot of things on a national level. So go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you, Phil. I do actually want to go back and into Don's earlier comments a little bit, just to be able to flesh some of the things out due to time constraints. You guys can't see it, but in the AAAS Journal, Volume 3, summer of 1975, the founder of the caucus, Dale Manami, had actually talked about. He wrote that Ken Kawaichi, a JA lawyer who had defended the strikers at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley during the Third World Strikes, he was actually the ones that were called to assist the Chinatown kids that were being arrested during the sweep. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that because simultaneously it was the same type of similar thing that was happening also in LA Chinatown, where you have not just Chinese lawyers, Chinese American lawyers helping out the community, but you have Japanese American folks coming in and helping. And that's quintessentially the development of an Asian American experience. Because if you're talking about people that are immigrants like me, coming from Hong Kong, coming from China, from Taiwan, elsewhere, we are taught by our parents about the kind of atrocities that happened during the war and the type of atrocities that were committed by Japanese soldiers. So we are taught to hate Japanese, right? And so this is what I'm trying to say, that this is the movement building here of understanding it's an Asian American consciousness, but Don talked about it also as a third world consciousness, that there is solidarity with the Black Power, with La Raza, right? And so we saw ourselves in that particular light, coming out of the 60s and the 70s. And so for me, in many ways, I feel that, as someone that immigrated during the late 60s, from Hong Kong and into Chicago, Chinatown, where my grandfather was, and then eventually moved to Iowa, where Margaret Fung was also, an expat Iowan. And both of us, are refugees, going into the East Coast. And that's where I think things also change, right? Because when Dale started the experiment of the Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco, Margaret went out, I believe, to the caucus, as well as the first Chinatown outreach lawyer in Boston, Gene Fong. And so these are the kind of, coastal exchanges that was going on, the experiments that would then allow different cities, satellites, to grow and try to figure out what models would potentially work and what models may not work so well. Okay, and so for us, Jean Fong graduated from Boston College Law School in '74. But she, along with other law students, other Asian American law students within the Boston area, like Pancho Chang, Richard Chin, Paul Yee, they were law students, just like what was happening in San Francisco and in other cities. Okay, they understood coming out of the '60s, that we need to give something back to our community. Because we were facing the kind of police sweeps that is much more synonymous with what's happening with the Black community, with the brown community now. We see it less, and we tend to forget that's our roots, right? That is the kind of experience that we had in solidarity with other communities of color. And so, so for those guys, that's how the Chinatown Outreach Office got started here in Boston in the early '70s. And so after Jean Fong left and became a solo practitioner, then came Regina Lee, somebody from New York, Chinatown, right? And so this is the kind of generational exchange that we would have, a baton, if you would, that is being carried into other races. Other newer generations would come along. And for me, I came here from Iowa for law school to Boston in the early '80s, and did not really understand, did not know, about the Asian American identity. And it was because of the experience that I had in law school with the Asian American Law Students Association, and the kind of work that was being done by classmates in earlier years. So in fact, one of the directors that is sitting on AALDEF right now is Sandy Leong. Sandy was 1 year ahead of me in law school. And so Sandy was one of a few of the other students that had pushed the dean at the law school to start a Chinatown outreach clinical, for the law school. And so each and every year, each and every semester, we would have to fight for the survival of the clinical. What did the clinical do? It allowed for the Asian American law students to go into Boston Chinatown and earn clinical credits, be supervised under Asian American lawyers like Regina Lee and Harry Yee, when they're doing a general civil legal services type of a practice. And so after my first year, in the second year and third year, I continued to take the clinical. And after I graduated, I became the program director for the clinical. And so this is how we continue to instill really Asian American studies within a law school curriculum through a clinical. Unfortunately, that experience at Boston College Law School ended finally by about 1993. But this is the kind of experiments that we can also attempt to restart, in other cities right now, to make sure that our Asian American communities are also served, right? And so, but the models that we've been talking about is very much a legal services type of a model. One of the things that we did not have enough time to talk about was the Asian Law Collective that was started also around the same time in the early '70s in Los Angeles, right? Which was not a legal services model, but much more of a private partnership, where essentially small lawyers in a small legal office would then practice, provide, it's like a corner store, if you would, back in those days. where they would do, again, a general practice, a criminal practice, and be able to sustain some sense of money in order to run the operations, to provide essentially services to the community. So for us, we are making sure, we're trying to make sure that a continued generation of Asian American activists, not just within the undergraduate component, but much more also in the law school component, would continue to be serving as feeders, if you would, to make sure that we have a next generation of legal activists carry on the Asian American experience. And we tend to forget that within Asian American studies, right? Because if you go back and look at, just analyze the earlier volumes of American Journal, by I think the third or fourth volume, they dedicated like 2 separate volumes alone, just alone on Asian American legal issues, Asian American civil rights issues. So that informs how important, how essential those issues about criminal rights, landlord-tenant rights, family, divorces, all those particular access to civil legal services as well as criminal rights, were to the Asian American experience. Bill, should we launch onto other things? I don't know how much time I have left.
Oh, I know you can go on forever. You're both a lawyer and a professor. I mean, let me quick jump in here with just our public service announcement that, again, we're thanking everyone for joining us today. This is a discussion about 50 years of Asian American community lawyering, looking back, looking ahead. Our guests are Andrew Leong, Alakananda Paul, and Don Tamaki. I'm your host, Phil Tajitsu Nash. And if you have any questions, please submit them in the chat. I noticed that some people are already starting to put them there, and we'll talk about them more later. Let me take a quick minute here to talk on behalf of AALDEF. AALDEF is the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, trying to follow that model of a legal defense education fund like the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. I noticed my friend Marina Shea is here, who was an Asian American woman who went to work for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So again, that's part of the synergy that we've all been talking about. Asian Americans didn't just work for Asian American rights. There are Asian Americans in the ACLU, in the National Organization for Women, in so many different groups all around the country. And that's important to realize too. We didn't just stay. I know Don was one of my heroes early on. I knew that he was working with several groups, legal services, the original Haber, the Reggie program, so many programs which were important feeders to get us into law school and get us into legal services type programs. So AALDEF is a national nonprofit that was founded in 1974. But again, like some of the other groups that have been described here, there were law students or even just non-lawyers, like Stanley Mark was a chemist. Margaret Fung was not a lawyer at that time. She went on to go to NYU Law School, distinguish herself there, but instead of taking a corporate job, she decided to join AALDEF. So a number of people came together, ironically, at a Chinatown health fair. And while they were talking about the health needs of Chinatown, they realized there were legal needs also. So this is the type of thing that was happening in communities all around the country. So AALDEF combines litigation, advocacy, education, and organizing. So many different things aside from these big mega cases. And AALDEF over the years has dealt with issues such as immigration, voting rights, economic justice for workers, educational equity, housing and environmental justice, elimination of anti-Asian violence and police misconduct and human trafficking. So like all the groups that we're describing here, we try to respond to the needs of the community that we're situated in, describing it as the New York City area, occasionally working with people in other cities, other parts of the country. I mean, now AALDEF works with people in many parts of the country. We have cases down in Texas, a lot of work in Philadelphia, and working with people up in Boston area, the Northeast. But instead of just spending all our resources litigating one giant case, we tried to find cases that we felt had impact. And that impact is not just defined the way lawyers define impact cases or class action cases. We would try to find something that, for example, would facilitate organizing, the way that Don described that earlier. We wanted to provide legal resources for community groups. So we've helped out, you know, the nail salon workers who are trying to organize and get better pay, better working conditions. So instead of just going in and starting new groups, we just provide the legal backup for some of those groups. We also would comment on legislation and policies, train law students, do voter surveys, exit polls, you know, a lot of things that help to build capacity, help to bring more people in. I remember when I was graduating from law school, somebody told me that there were 79 Asian Americans who graduated in 1979. And I looked around and said, yeah, well, none of them are around here. I was on the East Coast. And I was luckily part of a minority student program at Rutgers Law School that brought people in, gave us support, helped us to work together. And it's amazing when you have those type of programs. A number of us went on to become professors, went on to become community workers, went on to do a lot of important things, judges. And that's because we had that support as we were going through the program. And frankly, that's something that we need to do even more of these days, because our programs are sometimes being scaled back because of the right-wing attack on affirmative action. But affirmative action has been wonderful for our community. Asian Americans have benefited from that. So AALDEF currently has 17 staff, 300 volunteers, many pro bono attorneys. At the beginning, I remember attorneys like Benjamin Gim, William Maritani. There were so few of them. You know, we looked around and a lot of the support we got was from non-Asian American attorneys. But now on our board of directors and among the pro bono attorneys are many Asian Americans. So if you look back at AALDEF's case docket, if you go to the website at AALDEF.org and go to the history page, you'll see that the earliest cases, we were helping to stop the deportation of Filipino doctors, supporting the hiring of Chinese American workers at the Confucius Plaza construction site, helping Chinese Americans who were arrested protesting against police brutality. I mean, some of these cases are still very much like cases that are taking place around the country today. We finally opened an office in 1976, and I remember when that first office was formed at 43 Canal Street. It was a tiny little room. It was just there were a couple of desks right in that room. And I'm sure Don can describe things with the Asian Law Alliance and Andrew and Alaka. I mean, you don't start with a lot of resources. If you are not going to be a corporate attorney, you oftentimes are resourced impoverished, shall we say, and salary impoverished too. So we had this little office and people would come in and sometimes to get privacy, it was hard to get any privacy. But it allowed some of the Chinatown workers, the garment workers, and the restaurant workers, they could walk right up the stairs and come there. But I remember when we moved from there to a bigger office on Broadway near the courthouse, I brought along the bars that were on the windows at 43 Canal Street because people were afraid that people might walk in off the fire escape and break into the office. So I brought our bars with us, and they sat in the back of my office. And somebody once said to me, "What are those bars for?" I said, well, "I don't know. We might need them again." I mean, here we were in a professional office building. Nobody's going to break in, or if they're going to break in, they're going to break in through the front door. But again, I realized later I was carrying a piece of that mentality with me, that I still saw myself as being in Chinatown, even though I was pretty far away, a couple blocks away. And every resource was so precious. When you started an organization like that, we had spent good money buying those bars. So I'm not going to throw them away, But anyway, by 1978, we had started legal advice clinics with other groups, the Hamilton Madison House, the Korean Senior Service Center. And again, that is part of the synergy that informed our early efforts at Legal Services. No one group did anything, and even today, no one group does everything. We now have many groups in Chicago and Atlanta, and there's so many groups all around the country. It's very important that we document their histories as well. We finally, I came into the picture in 1979. I was a student at Rutgers Law School, and we were being sued by a quote unquote advantaged white male who didn't want our affirmative action program to take place. And so we students decided that we would fight back, because our law school, like every law school, has a problematic history when it comes to admitting people who look like us. So we Asian American students, including graduates, people who are in school, and future Asian American students, got together with the Asian American Legal Defense Fund, and we filed suit to be defendant interveners in the case Dougherty versus Rutgers School of Law. And the same thing happened with the Black and Latin American students. And the Women's Caucus also intervened, because they said we need the diversity that comes by having all of you here. And the student government even intervened, because they said our school is going to be impoverished if we don't have this quality of people coming in through this affirmative action program. So I was there as a first-year student, and that's when I met Stan and Margaret and others. And they said, you know, we're going to help you with this case. And it was wonderful. I learned civil procedure by watching them write these briefs and then motions. And it was, that's how we did community lawyering at that time. Probably should have gone to class a little bit more, but I did learn a lot by just participating in this case, and went on to be an intern and later a staff attorney, and now a board member at AALDEF. So AALDEF has gone on to file amicus briefs. We were involved with the FOLA versus Krebs back in 1979, support for public works set-asides for minority businesses. We helped to organize the Silver Palace workers who were protesting employers stealing their tips in 1980. And I remember as a law student marching around, you know, carrying my law school books, kind of reading on the side. But, you know, we were there helping these people to unionize. And again, that gets back to what Don was saying at the beginning. We had a model that our legal work was informed by and supportive of the efforts by the community members to empower themselves, to be treated respectfully, and to get the wages they deserve, and so on. AALDEF was involved in tenant organizing, having a housing fair. In 1984, we joined the Public Interest Legal Center at 99 Hudson Street, along with the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and the National Organization for Women Legal Defense and the NAACP Legal Defense. So we were part of an ecosystem of social justice. And again, all the stuff we're talking about today, Asian Americans forming legal organizations or providing legal services, is part of a bigger movement for social justice that all of our participants have talked about today. So I'm going to stop there. Obviously, I can go on quite a bit further. I'm going to just open up first to the three of you. Is there any story that's been brought to mind by listening to the other participants talk? Don, you want to start?
You know, the idea of using legal cases to promote organizing and empowerment was in the early, I'd say mid to late 70s, pretty controversial. You know, people thought impact litigation meant class action, and lawyers have no business doing any organizing because, you know, they're trained as lawyers, and that's a full-time job. And so we were experimenting with a few things. And one of them was, there's a housing project in the middle of Chinatown called Pingyun. And at that time, one of the most rundown housing projects in the city. I mean, no heat, no hot water kind of thing. And the tenants were afraid to complain about it because that was the only housing available. And so Ed Lee, who was then a law student at Berkeley, began through the Asian Law Caucus volunteering, you know, working with the tenants, and he spoke Cantonese. His mother was a garment worker. His father was a chef in a Chinese restaurant. And because of his background, he could really identify with the tenants in this building. And so for a year, he was working with them, encouraging them to exert their rights. And they were too intimidated to do so. But he was laying the groundwork. And at that time, again, in the face of some folks saying, you guys shouldn't be doing this. There are legal cases that have to be done. Why are you doing it? And we just felt that this might lead to something in terms of a lasting sort of empowerment. So it all changed when a garment worker came home, young person, woman, and she goes to use the elevator, it's broken, and she has to go, and this is a housing project that goes up 6 or 7 floors. She has to go use the hallways and the stairwell, and the lights are out. And she's attacked, she's raped in the stairwell, and she's dragged up over one of the higher balconies and thrown off to the, the patio plaza below. And the perpetrator just came down, found she was still alive, dragged her up and threw her off again. And that triggered, I mean, that was a tipping point. And it just, the tenants basically had it. It was like, enough is enough. And that began the rent strike. And Ed Lee, who had been cultivating his relationship with the tenants for a year, was suddenly at ground zero for this. And he had developed trust. The caucus provided the legal, services, and ironically, he became later the mayor of the city. But he spent many years suing the city, and particularly over this this housing project, and it became sort of a major cause célèbre in San Francisco, and ultimately the tenants, of course, won, and a Chinatown Tenants Union and other forms of political organizing, emerged from that. And so we thought that was a good example where lawyers can actually play a role in building institutions. But it all started with, not having no heat, no hot water. And so it's just a matter of getting people to assert their rights and begin to feel empowered. And that was a time with literally no representation on the governing boards of the city. And of course, over time, give it so many years and this sense of empowerment later, it's complete. The landscape in San Francisco is completely different. But it started in part, I'm not saying the Asian Law Caucus should take all the credit, but that was a major deal. And so that's just one example where this sort of experimenting developed, and it actually worked out. And to this day, those models have been followed, sort of applying it to different other things. But I do want to say again, I want to emphasize basically this thinking, this development of consciousness, development of we can actually do this, and being on a mission to actually to change things really started from knowing our history and knowing how racism works, and being exposed to that. And again, I credit that to ethnic studies setting the intellectual foundation for that kind of thinking and experimentation to happen.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I think, Phil, what you had mentioned earlier, it reminded me, I guess, why I am teaching not to Asian American studies anymore now, but to Latino studies, right? Because, in terms of the kind of exchanges that we have, the kind of movements that we have about Asian American lawyers working, whether it was with NAACP, with La Raza, what have you. I recall that it was Don Nakanishi that said that, you really can't teach Asian American studies until you learn about Latino studies. And I recall that, years after he said it. And that's one of the reasons why, especially during the Trump years, we really need to re-engage with our communities, and not just the Asian American community, but with all communities, to be able to understand the roots of where we came from, not just as Asian American studies, not just as, Asian American legal people, right? But how we started, how, like you guys said, how racism work. And what Don Tamaki here said, not Nakanishi said, about the kind of different models that we have within law offices in the 70s. By the early 80s, with the Reagan administration, there were formal rules that prohibited legal services organizations from actually engaging in organizing. And so when there were, in fact, in Boston, huge garment factory closures that, I recall representing those particular garment workers, but I was treading very, very lightly because of those federal regulations that prohibited us from protesting, from doing any type of organizing, or things that would be construed as organizing the garment workers. But we find ways, right? Just very similarly with anti-Asian violence, by the time that, post Vincent Chin, we see also another era of anti-Asian violence, happening across the country. And here specifically in Boston, from the early 80s throughout the mid 80s and late 80s, there were waves and waves of anti-Asian violence. And I had to sneak around in order to work, with various different ADAs to prosecute the white assailants, because they didn't, those particular district attorneys or the attorney general's offices, they didn't have the linguistic capability. Whereas, like you mentioned about, like Don mentioned about Ed, right? My mom worked in the garment factory as well as the restaurant industry. And my parents owned a small Chinese restaurant when we were in Iowa. And so, knowing the language, knowing the culture, I had easier access to be able to go in and work, with the prosecution and help out some of the Chinese American victims because of the linguistic as well as the cultural type of barriers that folks would not be able to understand. So again, it's about how creative we are within the community to deal with and address the various different crises that may be happening.
Alaka, were any thoughts raised by listening to your co-participants here?
Yeah, mostly to you. I just didn't mention that we always networked with other organizations. Like we worked with National Organization of Women. I remember participating in a seminar with Patricia Ireland, at that time president of NOW, about domestic violence in Asian community. And then we participated in Rally for Women's Lives on the Mall in 96, 97, a big group of us went there. And also I wanted to mention that there are South Asian women's organizations in many parts of the country now. There's New York, New Jersey. Actually, the one in New Jersey started first in mid-1980s, and then New Jersey, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, Texas, Chicago, everywhere. And we always network with each other. Like I remember when I was still in DC, someone's friend or relative had contacted one of our members. And then we helped, ASHA helped the starting of the organization in San Francisco Bay Area. So we immediately found the resources in the Bay Area, and we have helped that woman. So if someone's relative or friend is in another city, we always networked with each other and tried to help us out. So it was not only in that community, but more or less nationally, we tried to help each other, and I'm sure they're still doing it now. That's what I wanted to mention, because you talked about how we connect to each other. And yeah, it's very enlightening, all the things that I'm hearing and the whole history. We hear bits and pieces, but it's good to hear from people who have been directly involved in things like that. I'm glad that I'm here.
Thank you, Alaka. I'm looking at the chat here, seeing questions. John Lee is asking, can any panelists speak to the utility of having Asian American individuals and attorneys improving the delivery of legal services to Asian American clients and communities, and in some instances, it's literally life-changing. You want to take that, Don or Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I saw, John, your other comment about how can we get younger lawyers, engaged in this process. And I'm going to put it back to Asian American studies too, okay? The Asian American studies that we were exposed to was a very activist-oriented scholarship, and it emphasized the obligation to go back to our own communities and other communities of color to do something, to contribute at some level. And as the programs have developed, and I don't want to make a sweeping generalization, so I'll just speak about the programs I know at Berkeley, for instance. The scholarship and the academia has become far more institutionalized, and there's good in that because it advances that particular academic field, but it's less connected to the community. And so there isn't that sense of same urging people to be participants in what's going on. And as John Lee pointed out, some of these cases are life-saving. I've done dozens. This is Alaka probably done this too. Dozens of temporary restraining orders on domestic violence kind of cases. And housing, the same. It's the difference between having shelter and being, houseless. So at that level, yeah, lawyers can certainly contribute. They have a duty to. There's other areas too, not just those areas, but we're seeing attacks on democracy itself. Threatened like never before in modern history, in modern American history. And lawyers, for instance, need to speak out, but so is everybody else. But I think there has to be an underlying scholarship pointing these things out and then urging participation. And that is not there to the extent it was when we were going through these programs. And because of it, I think, especially in this society that's become so materialistic, and it's sort of a look at me, social media culture, that it's easy basically to sort of ignore that and get on with your career, and not understanding that each of us stands on the shoulders of somebody else. I'll just throw in another thing that I think we need to address, and that is the siloism, the tribalism that we're seeing, where basically each race or community kind of sticks up for itself only, is a problem, because that's not how systemic racism works. And I agree with you, Andrew, about the anti-Asian violence thing. I'm glad that there's a light being shined on it. It's been happening for a long time, with the exception of Vincent Chin that got national notoriety. He hasn't gotten national notoriety until now, and it spiked after this Chinese virus thing with Trump. But I think we need to go further than that and ask where the hate comes from in the first place. And one of the things I've learned, being on the California Reparations Task Force, this is the first state and the only state in the nation so far to study the impact of enslavement and Jim Crow and all of the iterations of exclusion and discrimination that followed, is that the hate comes from somewhere, and I think in a nutshell, the dehumanization and the subordination that had to happen in 1619 to basically treat people as cattle, just bled over. And so, yeah, slavery ended in 1865, but it just morphed into different forms of hate that not only put a target on the backs of Black people, but on occasion, we find our own selves in the crosshairs. And so you can line up there's a racial hierarchy here of Black and Native people on the bottom, and white, lives being valued more than any others on top, and then everybody else in the middle, whether that's Asian Americans or Latinos or whatever. And so I guess what I'm saying is that, yeah, this kind of racial pathology, and it affects everybody, all of us, regardless of race. And when people adopt that ideology, I mean, look at what happened in the LA City Council when people were left talking, they thought that nobody could hear them, or what happened in Memphis, or the Black on Asian hate crimes, let alone white on Asian hate crimes. People adopt that kind of, and we do too, Asian Americans, adopt same, racial attitudes toward Black African Americans. So there's a core thing going on here that I think we need to look to when we look at things like anti-Asian violence and other things. So again, I think it needs to start from an intellectual foundation that I'll put on the scholars to develop and then message out. But I think those things are really crucial. So sort of a long answer, Phil, to your question. But
No,
And I'll make it longer, Don.
Leave it to Andrew.
It is really the duty of Asian American studies to remind ourselves where we came from, right? Especially the California experience. If all of us start with 1854 with People versus Hall, that will really put us all back into our place to understand really why solidarity is necessary and why white supremacy exists, to create the kind of laws that we have and the kind of protections that we have for whites, okay? And just because now we seemingly are white adjacent, right? That we lose sight of the kind of internal struggles that get to where we are. And insofar as the state of Asian American studies is concerned, I'd be very, very honest. The reason why I've been turned off to go to these particular conferences is because we no longer speak the language of the 60s. We no longer remember where we came from, our roots, and why we do what we do. And so, when I used to go to these particular conferences, and I myself as a professor, I go in, what the hell are they talking about? I don't understand, right? And so, I'm not even just talking about Asian American studies. I'm talking about, I recall the first national conference that we had in Little Tokyo in 2007, the Right to the City conference, where we had academics, we had community organizers, we had everybody across the country gathered together to try to deal with this particular issue about, housing rights, okay? And ahead of the conference, we had like scholarships up the wazoo for people to read, okay? And so when it came to my turn, I said, it's great that we provide all this background information and reading to people, but how many of our community organizers that are working within our communities actually have the ability to understand this and to hear and listen what's going on? And the immediate comment that I got back was that I was being anti-intellectual. Whereas all of my Latino brothers and sisters, all my Haitian Creole brothers and sisters, all my Chinese brothers and sisters, organizers, they were applauding. They were hooping it up because they understood what I was talking about. They didn't understand what the hell was going on, what these articles were about, okay? When the whole basic issue is about the kind of disparity that happens within housing rights, okay? So for us, we need to re-engage. We need to remind ourselves, what was the founding core, the reason as to why Asian American studies came to the fold in the first place.
And I would like to add on that. I hope that everyone watching this will go back and look at the case involving Don Nakanishi's tenure at UCLA. where Dale Minami, somebody we've mentioned before, who helped to found the Asian Law Caucus and has done other things, actually helped to found AALDEF also. But that was really a turning point moment, both for the Asian American legal community and for Asian American studies, because somebody like Don with stellar credentials from Yale and Harvard, and he was there ready to take his place as a political science professor at UCLA. And all of a sudden he was told, no, you're teaching and writing about this Asian American studies stuff, and we don't know what that is. You're not going to get a degree, or you're not going to get a position here at UCLA. And so Dale and others, fought in the courts and in the court of public opinion. And there was some pressure put on the state legislature about the money that was going to go to UCLA. There's a lot of levers that were pushed. And this is the type of community lawyering that is not just going only in the courtroom. And I think that was a very successful example. We had a comparable struggle later on to try and get Jack Chen his tenure at NYU. And what happened in both of their cases was they didn't get the tenure in the department they wanted. Jack, instead of getting a history department, he was put over to like international studies. Don, instead of being a political science, he was put over to the education school. And again, these are fine divisions of the university, but it's a way of saying, if you study Asian American studies, you're going to be, there's a price to pay. And I remember when I first started teaching as as a law professor in 1986, the word out was, don't write anything about Asian American stuff. Don't write about controversial topics like abortion or anything else. Just write about, the covenant of Greenacre and blah, 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 And now I look at my brothers and sisters and family members who are in Asian American studies and Asian American law professors. They're writing about the full spectrum of issues, which is wonderful because our community is dealing with a broad spectrum of issues. So to be good scholars, we need to write about them. So it's very, very important that we look back at that history and how the Asian American legal movement and the Asian American studies movement have been intertwined. Now, it's 4:05, we're ending at 4:15. If each of you could make a statement that kind of summarizes it, but also something that, what do you want people to take away from this? What are things that can grow this next generation of Asian American lawyers and people who are building the legal capacity of our community? Who wants to go with that? Don, you want to start?
Well, since this is sponsored by the Association for Asian American Studies, I'm hoping there's an appreciation basically for laying that foundation of consciousness raising, because it led to so many organizations and movements and cases and all this stuff that's happened since: scholarship, books, film documentaries. It changed the landscape completely. But to Andrew's point, I would also want to leave you with a message to re-energize that. And I think scholarship in the field is all valuable, but I would say the activist part has not been there, in more recent years. And connecting with community organizations and social movements, I think, is just critical. And because it does influence the people filtering through the programs, and people do take Asian American studies. I'm glad of that. But they also need to be influenced to turn their sort of scholarly studies into some participation at some level. So I would just leave that message.
Alaka, you ready to say something?
I just wanted to say this address to the younger generation, the generation that was born here, and they are pretty much more successful than probably our generation, and they kind of very much integrated into the society, and they sometimes don't think that activism is necessary anymore. And but I'll tell them the story, but we still look different. And recently, I mean, during the anti-Asian violence, which is, I hope it has subsided a little bit during COVID, He was a very brilliant, successful, beautiful anchor woman, Asian anchor woman who was was in San Francisco for something. And somebody came, she was born here, and somebody came to her car and said, and she was afraid because she thought first she had 2 children with her, she put them in the car, inside the car. And then and when she was getting in, this person came and told her that, why don't you go back? She's in her early 50s, born here, very brilliant and successful. And she was just saying that, I couldn't even imagine that somebody can. So this is not completely going away, as we said, it's taking the same form. I mean, taking another different form, but so people should be aware. And also this Asian American Studies program, I know Berkeley has a very good Asian American Studies program, but Asian Americans don't generally many Asian Americans don't think it is important to participate in that, take courses in everything. In fact, my grandson goes to a private school in San Francisco, and he actually not started. He actually requested that they start a ethnic studies program, and somebody did listen to him, and they made a trip to Berkeley to see. They have a very good ethnic studies program. So how do they do it and all that? So, but very few people are, because as you know, in California, there are so many Asian Americans, but they are not, the generation that's coming after us are not aware of what had happened, what's the history, and not being active enough, I think.
Agreed.
Yeah, what Alka mentioned is so very important. Is the for the newer generation, it's so easy for them to, it's not forgetting. They never know. They never knew, and so again, it harkens back to the duty of Asian American Studies to make sure it's not just the literary, it's not just the identity, but to understand, why we have not belonged. This whole aspect about white adjacent is so fragile. It could just go just like that, okay? With anti-Asian violence. And I remember I was kidding with Dale Manami a while back. I said, well, you and your parents and grandparents, you guys were in the camps with the kind of trade wars that's happening with China, between China and the US. Right? With my generation, we could potentially wind up in those same historic camps. Okay. Yes. So that's why Don, with the work that he and others are doing with, whatever, with the state reparations, apologies, nationally during the 80s and now again on a state basis. Okay. It is so important for us to make sure that, history, accurate history, not, watered down, race erased type of history is actually taught within K through 12, within college, within law school, within each and every step along the way, so that we don't forget and we learn, where we actually came from and how this country got to where it is, to just make sure that into the future we don't commit the same atrocities that we've seen in the past.
Okay, thank you, participants. Let me make my closing statement, and also let me just quickly review the thank yous again. The wonderful technical work being done by the 1882 Foundation, we really appreciate it. You can go to their website at 1882foundation.org, where you can learn more about them, and their Facebook page, facebook.com 1882 Project Foundation, is where a copy of this program is going to be living. Other groups may post it as well, but I just wanted to have a special shout out for them. Again, thanking the Association for Asian American Studies, Pawan Dhingra, the president, Tamara Ko, Jennifer DeLuna, thanking Mia Owens, May Che, Gabriella Chu, Ted Gong, and Stan Liu from the 1882 Foundation. At AALDEF, thanking the Executive Director, Margaret Fung, and staff, and my co-president, Richard Kim, and the board. At the Smithsonian, thanking Sojin Kim from the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, thanking Theo Gonzalez and Lawrence Min Bowie Davis from the Asian Pacific American Center. And again, thanking our three presenters, Alaka, Don, and Andrew. For my closing statement, I'll say what I usually say at all of my programs, no matter what I'm talking about, which is, we are swimming in an ocean of isms. All of us are wet. All of us are dealing with issues of racism, sexism, homophobia, ageism, on and on and on. And this notion that somebody is woke is a fake issue. All of us are struggling to deal with these issues, and we are trying to be better about it. And we, as Asian American attorneys, are helping to level this playing field and making it better for everyone. And we can't rely only on the attorneys. We need to remember that prevention, intervention, legislation, these are three different strategies for changing systemic racism, the systemic problems that we're dealing with here. It's so important that everyone watching this program and everyone in general, but we as attorneys have a special mission. When I went to law school, Arthur Kanoy said, a great attorney responds to the great issues of his or her times. And I think that is something that each of us coming out of law school, or even who are practicing law or teaching law, we have to remember that, because as has been pointed out by the three panelists here, there is a lot of history, we've stood on the shoulders of our parents, our grandparents, other community members. My Rutgers Law School program was created by the struggles of the Black community that opened up this opportunity for me to go to law school. So it's very important that we acknowledge that history. We reach back to pull other people up. I want to give a shout out to Don again for the wonderful work he's doing on the Black reparations panel in California. This is the type of thing where he learned doing Japanese American redress, and now he's using that expertise in another venue. Alaka doing such wonderful work. She could have just been a successful engineer, but no, she reached back to help her sisters and other people within the South Asian community. That is the kind of spirit. And of course, Andrew, you've been doing that for years as well in so many different venues. We have to start with excellence in whatever our field is. That's great. And moving beyond that, I hope that each of us will take the lessons of our three panelists here and try to bring justice as well as law to the world at large. So thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure being here today, and we hope you've enjoyed the program.
Thank you. Be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.